a massive caravan stretching miles across the desert, 60,000 people, 12,000 enslaved servants all dressed in Persian silk, 80 camels each carrying up to 300 pounds of pure gold. The year is 1324, and the ruler making this journey would crash the gold market of an entire civilization just by passing through. African kingdoms trading as equals with European powers, Ethiopian emperors sending ambassadors to the Pope in Rome, Kongolese nobility writing letters in Portuguese to European monarchs. A wealthy African emperor so rich that when he gave away gold as charity, he destabilized the economy of one of the world's most powerful nations for over a decade. This isn't some fantasy. This isn't alternative history. These are documented facts that challenge everything we think we know about Africa before European colonization. You see, when most people think about African-European contact, they immediately jump to the transatlantic slave trade that began in the 1500s. But the real story, the one that's been largely forgotten or deliberately obscured, is far more complex and fascinating. For centuries before the slave ships ever set sail, Africa and Europe were connected through vast trade networks, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchanges that involved African rulers negotiating from positions of power, not weakness. What if I told you that African gold literally built medieval Europe's economy? That European cartographers drew maps showing African kings sitting on golden thrones? That the Catholic Church welcomed African Christian emperors as equals and appointed the first sub-Saharan African bishop in 1518? The deeper we dig into this history, the more we discover a narrative that's been systematically erased. A story of African kingdoms that were wealthy, sophisticated, and politically savvy long before Europeans arrived on their shores claiming to bring civilization. This is the untold story of African-European encounters centuries before the slave trade, and I promise you, it's going to completely reshape how you understand world history. Let's go back to where these connections truly began, not in the palaces of Europe or the courts of African kings, but in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, the Sahara Desert. Now, you might think of the Sahara as an impenetrable barrier, a vast sea of sand that separated civilizations. But you'd be wrong. The Sahara wasn't a wall, it was a highway. Around the 3rd century CE, something remarkable happened. Berber merchants from North Africa figured out how to cross this massive desert using camels, and by the 7th and 8th centuries, they'd established regular trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world with West Africa. These weren't just occasional expeditions. We're talking about massive, organized camel caravans, some containing thousands of animals, making regular journeys across routes that were mapped with incredible precision by Arab geographers. And what were they trading? 2 commodities that would shape the medieval world: gold and salt. Now here's what makes this fascinating. In West Africa, particularly in the regions that would become the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, gold was abundant. The Bambouk and Bure gold fields produced some of the purest gold in the known world. But salt? Salt was incredibly scarce. Meanwhile, in North Africa and the Mediterranean, the situation was reversed. They desperately needed gold for currency, for art, for demonstrating wealth and power, but they had access to massive salt deposits in the Sahara Desert at places like Tagaza. The trans-Saharan trade networks that developed were sophisticated beyond belief. Merchants didn't just carry goods, they carried ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Islam spread along these routes, transforming West African societies. Arabic scholarship reached Timbuktu and other cities, which would become centers of learning that rivaled anything in Europe. And here's something that might blow your mind. West African gold literally became the currency that powered the medieval Mediterranean economy. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab merchants in southern Moroccan towns like Sijil Massa were buying gold from Berber middlemen who'd traded salt for it with West African states. This gold made its way into the coffers of Islamic caliphates, Byzantine emperors, and eventually Christian European kingdoms. The gold dinars minted by the Almoravid dynasty, which controlled parts of North Africa and Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries, were made from West African gold and were considered the most valuable currency in the Western Islamic world because the gold was so pure. But it wasn't just trade in commodities. The wealth generated by the trans-Saharan gold trade gave rise to some of the most powerful empires in African history. The Ghana Empire, which flourished from the 6th to 13th centuries, built its entire economy around controlling this trade. The rulers of Ghana didn't even mine the gold themselves. They simply taxed everything that moved through their territory. They kept the gold nuggets for themselves as a royal monopoly and let their subjects trade the gold dust. This system made Ghana's rulers phenomenally wealthy and powerful. By the 10th century, the salt and gold trade had become so central to Ghana's economy that the capital city, Kumbi Saleh, became a major cosmopolitan center. Arab geographer al-Bakri, writing in the 11th century, described seeing the Ghanaian court with gold-embroidered caps, golden saddles, shields, and swords mounted with gold, and even dogs wearing collars adorned with gold and silver. This was a civilization of immense sophistication and wealth, and Europeans barely knew it existed. Then came 1324, and everything changed. This was the year that Africa announced itself to the world in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Mansa Musa, the 9th emperor of the Mali Empire, decided to undertake the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is expected to complete at least once in their lifetime. But Mansa Musa didn't just go to Mecca. He turned his religious obligation into the greatest publicity stunt in medieval history. Mansa Musa set out from his capital at Niani with an entourage that beggars belief. The numbers recorded by contemporary Arab chroniclers are staggering. 60,000 people accompanied him on this journey. 12,000 enslaved servants, all dressed in brocade and Yemeni silk. Each of these servants carried a golden staff and 4 pounds of gold bars. In addition, there were 500 enslaved people who walked directly in front of the emperor, each carrying a gold-adorned staff. 80 camels, and here's where it gets really insane, each camel carried between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. The caravan traveled over 2,700 miles from Mali, through the Sahara to Cairo, then on to Mecca. And everywhere Mansa Musa stopped, he gave away gold. Not small amounts, we're talking lavish, extravagant distributions of wealth. He gave gold to the poor. He gave gold to officials. He bought souvenirs with gold. He commissioned mosques to be built every Friday wherever he stopped to pray. He was literally building religious structures across North Africa with his seemingly endless supply of gold. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo in July 1324, he caused an absolute sensation. The Mamluk Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world, expected Mansa Musa to prostrate himself before him as was customary. But Mansa Musa refused. He said he would only bow before God. This wasn't arrogance, this was a calculated display of power. Eventually, Musa did bow, but the message was clear. He was the Sultan's equal, not his inferior. And then Mansa Musa did something that still echoes through history. He spent so much gold in Cairo that he crashed the entire Egyptian economy. Contemporary sources report that the value of gold in Egypt depreciated by 20%, and didn't recover for over a decade. Think about that. One man's generosity was so extreme, it destabilized the currency of one of the most important economic centers in the medieval world. When Mansa Musa passed through Cairo again on his way home and realized what he'd done, he actually tried to fix it by borrowing gold from Egyptian lenders at high interest rates to take gold out of circulation. Even this attempt to help showed his incredible wealth. He paid back these loans immediately upon returning to Mali. But the impact of Mansa Musa's Hajj went far beyond economics. This journey put Mali, and by extension West Africa, on the map literally. In 1375, just 51 years after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, a Catalan atlas was created that showed the king of Mali sitting on a golden throne in West Africa, holding a golden nugget. European cartographers, who had largely ignored Africa beyond the Mediterranean coast, suddenly knew there was a land of incredible wealth south of the Sahara. The legend of Mansa Musa spread throughout Europe and the Islamic world, and for the next 2 centuries, maps produced in Italy, Germany, and Spain would reference Mali and its golden king. Mansa Musa didn't just bring gold on his journey. When he returned to Mali, he brought with him Arab scholars, architects, government bureaucrats, and religious teachers. The most famous of these was the architect Ishaq el-Taujan, who introduced advanced building techniques to Mali. El-Taujan designed the great mosques at Gao and Timbuktu, including the still-standing Jinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu, which remains one of Africa's most iconic structures. Under Mansa Musa's rule, Timbuktu transformed from a trading post into one of the world's premier centers of Islamic learning. The city's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. The University of Sankore became comparable to the great universities of Europe and the Middle East, attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. Students studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. This was happening while much of Europe was still struggling through the aftermath of the Black Death. And here's what often gets forgotten. Mansa Musa's Mali Empire was vast. At its peak, it stretched across 500,000 square miles, encompassing what is now Mali, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Mauritania. Mansa Musa controlled not just the gold fields, but also the salt mines, the trade routes, and multiple vassal kingdoms. His empire was larger than Western Europe, and under his rule, the routes were so safe from bandits that merchants could travel for months without fear of being robbed. But Mali wasn't the only African kingdom engaged with the wider world. While West Africa was connecting with the Mediterranean through the Sahara, another African kingdom was establishing direct diplomatic relations with Europe through an entirely different route, and their story is just as remarkable. Since the 14th century, European Christians had been obsessed with a legend called Prester John. According to this myth, somewhere beyond the Islamic world, there existed a powerful Christian king who ruled a vast empire. Europeans believed that if they could ally with Prester John, they could encircle and defeat the Muslim states that controlled the Holy Land and blocked European trade routes to Asia. For centuries, Europeans searched for this legendary Christian king, first in Asia, then in India. They never found him because he didn't exist as they imagined him. But there was a Christian kingdom in Africa, and it was very real. The Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, ruled by the Solomonic dynasty, had existed since ancient times. Ethiopian Christians traced their faith back to the 4th century CE, making their church one of the oldest in the world. They had their own unique form of Christianity, distinct from both Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and they possessed their own ancient Christian traditions, including claims to house the Ark of the Covenant. In 1402, Ethiopian Emperor Dawit sent official diplomatic representatives to Venice. This wasn't a chance encounter or some random travelers. This was a formal embassy, complete with expensive gifts, letters of introduction, and a specific mission: to establish diplomatic relations with European powers and to recruit artisans willing to travel to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian ambassadors were chaperoned by Antonio Bartoli, a Florentine merchant, and they caused quite a stir in Venice. The Venetians were fascinated. They had finally encountered what they believed were subjects of the legendary Prester John. The fact that these Africans were Christians, that they were sophisticated diplomats bearing gifts and seeking craftsmen and technological exchange, completely upended European assumptions. The Ethiopian embassy led to the creation of the first known European itinerary detailing how to reach Ethiopia from Venice, and Venetian scholars even compiled the first Amharic Latin dictionary. But this was just the beginning. Throughout the 15th century, Ethiopian pilgrims and diplomats became regular visitors to Europe. They traveled to Rome, where they met with popes. They visited the Aragonese court in Spain. They attended the Council of Florence in 1441, one of the most important ecclesiastical councils of the medieval period. At this council, Ethiopian clergy participated in theological discussions with Catholic leaders about potentially reunifying the Christian churches. What's remarkable about these Ethiopian-European encounters is how they were encounters between equals. The Ethiopians weren't coming as supplicants or conquered people. They were coming as fellow Christians, as representatives of a powerful kingdom, as peers of European monarchs. And Europeans, desperate for allies against the expanding Ottoman Empire and still dreaming of crusades to reclaim Jerusalem, treated them as such. The Ethiopian emperor sent multiple embassies to European courts throughout the 15th century. One embassy went to Rome in 1481. These weren't just religious missions. The Ethiopians sought military alliances, technological transfers, and trade agreements. Ethiopian nobles sent their children to study in Europe. One Ethiopian prince, Enrique, the son of a future Congolese king, studied in Lisbon and Rome and was consecrated as a bishop in 1518, becoming the first sub-Saharan African Catholic bishop. The cultural exchange went both ways. European craftsmen, particularly Portuguese, began traveling to Ethiopia. Some married into Ethiopian noble families and received land rights. Ethiopian rulers commissioned European artists and architects. The relationship wasn't one of colonizer and colonized, it was one of mutual interest and cultural exchange. This Ethiopian-European relationship would eventually lead to one of the most significant military alliances in the history of African-European relations. In 1541, when the Ethiopian Christian kingdom faced an existential threat from the Sultanate of Adal, a Muslim state to the east, the Portuguese sent a military expedition to aid Ethiopia. 400 Portuguese soldiers, equipped with firearms, fought alongside Ethiopian forces to defend the Christian kingdom. This wasn't Europeans conquering Africa. This was Europeans and Africans fighting side by side as allies. But perhaps the most sophisticated example of African-European diplomatic relations before the slave trade took over everything can be found in the Kingdom of Congo and its relationship with Portugal. In 1483, Portuguese explorer Diogo Cao reached the mouth of the Congo River and made contact with the Kingdom of Congo. But here's what's crucial to understand. The Portuguese didn't find some primitive society waiting to be civilized. They found a highly organized state with sophisticated political structures, extensive trade networks, and a wealthy aristocracy. The Portuguese were actually impressed by what they encountered. The Kingdom of Congo was massive. It stretched across what is now northern Angola, the Republic of Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and parts of Gabon. The capital, Mbanza, Congo, was a major urban center with tens of thousands of inhabitants, organized markets, and a complex system of governance under the Manicongo, the King of Kings. Rather than conquering Congo, the Portuguese proposed an alliance. In 1491, Portuguese missionaries, teachers, and technical experts arrived in Congo. The Manicongo at the time, Nzinga a Nkuwu, along with his son Mavemba a Nzinga, were baptized and took Christian names, Joan I and Afonso I. This wasn't forced conversion. This was a political calculation. The Congolese rulers saw advantages in adopting Christianity. It gave them access to Portuguese technology, established them as equals in the eyes of European monarchs, and opened up new trade opportunities. When Afonso I became Manicongo in 1509, he took this relationship even further. Afonso was highly educated, fluent in Portuguese, and genuinely devout in his Christian faith. He established schools in Mbanza, Congo, where over 400 children of nobles learned to read and write in Portuguese. He sent Congolese students to study in Lisbon and Rome. He commissioned Portuguese architects to build stone churches and government buildings in the Congolese style. The capital's timber elite houses were rebuilt with fired bricks, stone, and lime. The original palisade walls were replaced with stone walls 20 feet high and 3 feet thick. Afonso corresponded regularly with Portuguese kings, addressing them as brother monarchs. These weren't simple letters. They were sophisticated diplomatic documents dealing with trade agreements, military alliances, religious matters, and technological transfers. Afonso requested and received Portuguese military assistance in his wars of expansion against neighboring kingdoms. In exchange, he provided Portugal with trade goods, including ivory, copper, cloth, and, yes, enslaved people captured in wars. Here's where the story gets complicated and ultimately tragic. Initially, the slave trade between Congo and Portugal was relatively limited and regulated. Congolese law specified who could and couldn't be enslaved, typically prisoners of war or criminals. Female slaves couldn't be exported, and there were regulations about the treatment of enslaved people. But as Portuguese demand for slaves grew, particularly to supply their sugar plantations on the island of São Tomé, the system began to break down. Portuguese merchants started operating independently, ignoring the royal monopoly and Congolese regulations. They began trading directly with local nobles, bypassing the central government. They started enslaving Congolese freemen, something that was explicitly illegal under Congolese law. Afonso I saw what was happening and tried desperately to stop it. In 1526, he wrote a famous letter to King João III of Portugal that stands as one of the most powerful documents in African history. In it, Afonso wrote, "It is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves, nor outlet for them, because it is our will that in these kingdoms there should not be any trade of slaves, nor outlet for them." He complained that Portuguese merchants were taking sons of the land and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives and selling them into slavery. He said, "Our country is being completely depopulated." But by this point, the Portuguese crown had lost control of its own merchants. The demand for enslaved labor in the Americas was beginning to rise, and the profits were too enormous for merchants to resist. Despite Afonso's protests, despite the violation of agreements, despite the King of Portugal himself issuing orders to regulate the trade, the enslaving of Congolese people continued and accelerated. What makes this so tragic is that Afonso I had created a genuine partnership between Congo and Portugal. The Kingdom of Congo had a highly literate elite, with dozens of schools in the capital and provincial cities. Congolese scribes kept detailed records of tax payments, tribute, grammar, law, and history. The church in Congo was independent and powerful, with Congolese clergy serving alongside Portuguese missionaries. Congolese ambassadors were received with honor in European courts. When Afonso sent his cousin Pedro de Sousa as an ambassador to Lisbon in 1512, the Portuguese king received him with full diplomatic honors. In 1535, another Congolese embassy traveled to Rome to meet with the Pope. These ambassadors wore Portuguese clothing, spoke fluent Portuguese, and negotiated as equals. In 1596, the Pope established São Salvador, the Christianized name for Mbanza Congo, as an episcopal see, elevating it to the same status as European cathedral cities. This tradition of Congolese diplomacy continued well into the 17th century. Congolese ambassadors traveled to Brazil, to Holland, to various European capitals. King Garcia II sent diplomats to multiple countries in 1643. These ambassadors weren't begging for help, they were negotiating trade agreements, discussing military alliances, and attempting to maintain Congo's church independence from Portuguese crown control. But the corrosive effect of the slave trade was undeniable. As more Portuguese settlers arrived in the region, as demand for enslaved people grew, as the profit margins became astronomical, the equal partnership Afonso had tried to build crumbled. Portuguese merchants increasingly operated independently of both the Portuguese crown and Congolese authority. They armed rival Congolese factions, destabilizing the kingdom. They established their own power base at Luanda in 1575, which became the capital of Portuguese Angola. By the late 16th century, internal succession disputes, fueled by Portuguese interference and weapons, tore Congo apart. A civil war dragged on through most of the 17th century. The kingdom that had once been a sophisticated, centralized state with a literate bureaucracy and diplomatic corps became fragmented, its population depleted by the slave trade that Afonso I had tried so hard to stop. And this is the ultimate tragedy of these pre-slave trade encounters. For several centuries, African kingdoms engaged with Europeans from positions of strength. Mansa Musa's Mali controlled the gold that Europe desperately needed. Ethiopian emperors negotiated military alliances as equals. The Kingdom of Congo established diplomatic relationships that were mutually beneficial. These weren't primitive societies waiting to be discovered and civilized. These were sophisticated states with complex governments, extensive trade networks, cultural achievements, and the political savvy to navigate international relations. But once the transatlantic slave trade began in earnest in the 16th century, everything changed. The sheer scale of demand for enslaved labor in the Americas was unlike anything the world had seen. Conservative estimates suggest that over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic between the 16th and 19th centuries, with millions more dying during capture or during the Middle Passage. This wasn't the limited, regulated slavery that had existed in various forms across many societies. This was chattel slavery, industrial-scale exploitation that reduced human beings to property that could be bought, sold, worked to death, and replaced. The slave trade did more than depopulate Africa. It fundamentally disrupted African political systems, economic structures, and social relationships. Kingdoms that had once derived power from controlling trade in gold, salt, ivory, and cloth found themselves increasingly dependent on the slave trade. European merchants deliberately armed competing factions to create instability and generate captives. Coastal African states found themselves with no choice but to participate in the trade or risk being enslaved themselves. The trans-Saharan trade routes that had connected Africa with the Mediterranean for a millennium became secondary to the coastal slave trade. Cities like Timbuktu, once centers of learning that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, declined. The sophisticated diplomatic relationships that kingdoms like Congo had established with European powers devolved into exploitative colonial relationships. The equal partnerships that had characterized earlier encounters gave way to relationships built on violence, coercion, and racial hierarchy. And here's what makes studying these pre-slave trade encounters so important. They prove that the narrative of African inferiority and European superiority was constructed, not inherent. When Mansa Musa crashed Cairo's gold market, he was demonstrating West African wealth that rivaled or exceeded anything in Europe. When Ethiopian diplomats debated theology with Catholic clergy at the Council of Florence, they were demonstrating intellectual sophistication that matched European scholarship. When Afonso I of Congo corresponded in fluent Portuguese with European monarchs and established schools throughout his kingdom, he was demonstrating political and administrative capabilities that would have impressed any European ruler. These African kingdoms had things that Europeans desperately wanted. Mali controlled gold that was essential to European and Mediterranean economies. Ethiopia offered the possibility of a Christian alliance that could outflank Muslim powers. Congo possessed resources, trade networks, and political stability that made them valuable partners. The relationships that developed weren't based on European technological or cultural superiority. They were based on mutual interest and relatively equal power dynamics. But the historical narrative that emerged later, particularly during the height of European colonialism in the 19th century, deliberately obscured these earlier relationships. Colonial ideologies required Africans to be portrayed as primitive, uncivilized, and incapable of self-governance. The idea that African kingdoms had once negotiated with European powers as equals, that African gold had built European economies, that African Christian emperors had been received with honor by popes and kings, these facts didn't fit the narrative that was being constructed to justify colonization and exploitation. So, these histories were forgotten or dismissed or reinterpreted through a colonial lens. The sophisticated diplomatic correspondence between Congolese and Portuguese kings was reduced to a footnote. The architectural achievements of Malian builders were attributed to foreign influence. The ancient Christian traditions of Ethiopia were treated as curious anomalies rather than evidence of African religious and cultural development. Modern scholarship has only recently begun to recover these histories in their full complexity. Historians are now examining Congolese letters in Portuguese archives, Ethiopian manuscripts in Vatican collections, Arab chronicles describing Mansa Musa's journey, and archaeological evidence from sites like Mbanza, Congo, and Timbuktu. What emerges is a picture of African-European relations before the slave trade that was far more sophisticated, far more equal, and far more complex than the simplified narrative of European discovery and African passivity. These pre-slave trade encounters matter because they demonstrate several crucial historical facts. First, they prove that African societies were fully capable of engaging with the wider world on their own terms. These weren't isolated backward kingdoms waiting for Europeans to connect them to global trade. They were already connected through extensive trans-Saharan networks that predated European maritime exploration. Second, they show that the wealth and resources flowed in multiple directions. Europeans needed African gold, African ivory, African knowledge of local trade routes and resources. The relationships that developed were partnerships, however imperfect, rather than simple exploitation. Third, they reveal that the racial hierarchies that would later characterize African-European relations weren't inherent or inevitable. When Ethiopian Christians met with European Christians in the 15th century, their shared faith mattered more than their skin color. When Congolese nobility learned Portuguese and sent their children to study in Europe, they were treated as aristocrats, not as racially inferior subjects. The construction of racial inferiority came later, as a justification for slavery and colonization. And finally, these encounters remind us that history is never as simple as we're taught. The story of African-European contact isn't just about the slave trade, the scramble for Africa, and decolonization. There were centuries of interaction before that, centuries when African rulers wielded real power, when African wealth commanded European respect, when African diplomats walked the halls of European palaces as honored guests. The gold that Mansa Musa gave away in Cairo didn't just destabilize the Egyptian economy. It eventually funded European art, European architecture, European trade. West African gold filled the coffers of European monarchs and paid for the manuscripts that scholars studied in European universities. The diplomatic skills that Ethiopian and Congolese rulers displayed in their correspondence with European powers demonstrate levels of political sophistication that challenge any notion of African primitiveness. But here's the crucial question. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we reconcile the sophisticated, powerful African kingdoms of the 14th and 15th centuries with the colonial exploitation that would follow? How do we understand the transition from Afonso I writing as an equal to European kings, to his successors being subjugated by Portuguese colonial administration? The answer is that we have to hold both realities in our minds simultaneously. We have to understand that the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization represented a fundamental rupture in African history, one that derailed political systems, economic structures, and social relationships that had developed over centuries. The Africa that Europeans colonized in the 19th century wasn't the same Africa that Mansa Musa ruled, or that sent ambassadors to Venice in the 15th century. Centuries of the slave trade had fundamentally transformed both continents and their relationship. But we also have to understand that the colonial narrative of African inferiority was a deliberate construction, one that required erasing or distorting the historical record of earlier African achievements and African-European partnerships. The sophisticated kingdoms that engaged with Europe before the slave trade don't fit the colonial story, so they were written out of it or relegated to the status of curious exceptions. Recovering these histories isn't about romanticizing pre-colonial Africa, or pretending that African societies were perfect, or that early African-European relations were always benevolent. The Kingdom of Congo engaged in slavery, after all, even if it was different from the chattel slavery that would later develop. Mali's wealth was built on controlling trade routes that included the trade in enslaved people, even if it was on a smaller scale than what would come later. Ethiopian rulers, like rulers everywhere, could be brutal in maintaining their power. The point isn't to replace one simplified narrative with another. It's to understand that African history is as complex, as nuanced, and as worthy of serious study as European or Asian history. African rulers made sophisticated political calculations, built vast trade networks, created cultural and intellectual achievements, and negotiated with foreign powers from positions of strength. When you look at Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, you're not just seeing a wealthy king showing off. You're seeing a ruler who understood the power of reputation, who knew that displaying his wealth would bring Mali prestige and attract trade and diplomatic attention. You're seeing someone who brought back architects and scholars because he understood that cultural and technological development would strengthen his kingdom. You're seeing political genius wrapped in religious devotion. When you read Afonso I's letters to Portuguese kings, you're not just seeing a naive ruler being exploited. You're seeing a sophisticated diplomat trying to navigate a rapidly changing situation, trying to get benefits from European technology and trade while maintaining his kingdom's independence and protecting his people from exploitation. You're seeing someone who understood that the Portuguese were both potential partners and potential threats, and who tried desperately to maintain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. When you learn about Ethiopian embassies to Europe, You're not just seeing exotic visitors. You're seeing representatives of an ancient Christian civilization engaging with European Christianity on equal terms, negotiating alliances, seeking technological exchanges, and maintaining their kingdom's independence and prestige on the international stage. These stories matter because they give us a more complete and honest understanding of African history, European history, and world history. They matter because they challenge the simplified narratives that still shape our understanding of Africa's past and its present. They matter because they remind us that the historical trajectory wasn't inevitable, that there were other possibilities, that African-European relations could have developed differently. And perhaps most importantly, they matter because they demonstrate that African societies possessed all the capabilities for development, prosperity, and sophisticated governance that any other societies possessed. The divergence that occurred in later centuries wasn't the result of African inferiority or European superiority. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, particularly the catastrophic impact of the transatlantic slave trade and later colonization. So, the next time you hear someone talk about Africa as the dark continent that needed European civilization, remember Mansa Musa's caravan of gold. Remember the libraries of Timbuktu, filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Remember Ethiopian ambassadors debating theology with European clergy. Remember Congolese nobility writing diplomatic correspondence in fluent Portuguese. Remember that for centuries, African kingdoms engaged with the rest of the world as equals, as partners, as powers to be reckoned with. The story of African-European encounters before the slave trade isn't a minor footnote in history. It's a crucial chapter that helps us understand how the world was connected long before the age of European colonial expansion. It's a story of sophisticated African states, of cultural and technological exchange, of diplomatic relationships between equals. It's a story that was deliberately suppressed because it didn't fit the narrative that later became necessary to justify exploitation and colonization. But the evidence is there in Portuguese archives, in Arabic chronicles, in Venetian records, in papal correspondence, in archaeological sites across Africa. The evidence is there in the gold that built European cathedrals, in the maps that showed African kings on golden thrones, in the letters that African rulers wrote to European monarchs. The evidence is there if we're willing to look for it, to take it seriously, and to incorporate it into our understanding of world history. This is the story that needs to be told, not because it erases the horror of what came later, but because it gives us a more complete and accurate picture of what existed before. It's a story of African agency, African achievement, and African engagement with the wider world on their own terms. It's a story that challenges assumptions, complicates narratives, and demands that we take African history seriously as a crucial part of world history. And that's a story worth remembering.